All right, this is the first recording, so let's just get right into things. I will be talking today about Karl of Knausgaard, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. It's a Norwegian name. I'm sorry. I tried to look it up, but to hear something and to replicate it are two entirely different things. But anyway, I will be talking about The Morning Star, the book, because it is the first book in a series which shares the exact same name, which is not confusing at all. The second and third books are translated into English, and I believe it is very important to note that this is translated by Martin Aitken. I also probably butchered that. But that is important because I have not read any of Knausgaard's other work, despite the My Struggle series being the thing he is supposedly most known for. So it is very difficult for me to comment on the prose of the book insofar as it relates specifically to Knausgaard's style versus what has been translated that way. But I will say this is my second time reading the book, and that's a very important thing because for me, I really like to read books twice before I comment on them insofar as to really dig in deep and give a strong impression. Because the first time through a book, I'm almost always going through it mostly for plot. And that's probably most of the things that I'll be talking about on this channel is first time going through a book, mostly plot, probably closer to what I would consider impressions rather than some kind of in-depth review. But since this is my second time through, or rather I should say my first time going through this series, it immediately stood out to me as something that could potentially very well become one of my favorite books. And certainly reading it again has cemented that possibility, but favorite is such a strong word that I'd want to go through it many more times before I finally settle on that. So my format in doing this that I'm going to go with is, first of all, I want to talk about why I chose the book. Secondly, I will give a brief recommendation so that anybody who decides that they want to read it without spoilers can go do so. Then I'll talk about a few good points of the book, a few bad points of the book, and then have another cutoff point, and then just kind of dive into the themes that really stuck out the most to me. So, first of all, why did I pick this book? The reason that I picked this book, frankly, was that The Third Realm appeared on Kirkus Reads. The review for it did in the upcoming reads, and I thought the cover looked good. So, when people say don't judge a book by its cover, the fact of the matter is we all do it. And the fact of the matter is it's a very important part of the book. But more than just saying the cover for The Third Realm, which was the book actually in question, which is the third book in the series, what attracted me to it was its use of blank space. And that's important because my other favorite author, my favorite author, Haruki Murakami, in his book Killing Kaminatore, he talks about Japanese art and how one of the specific aspects of Japanese art compared to Western art is the way that Japanese art uses a lot of white space and how that white space suggests things. And that's really how I feel about Murakami's work, and what makes it work for me is the way that everything isn't fed to you. It paints a picture, but it offers through its vagueness a sort of infinite depth. And that ties into Knausgaard because in much the same way I feel that reading, I'm getting ahead of myself, aren't I? So let me just back up and say that that possibility, the potentiality, what that cover evoked, and what going back through and looking at the other covers evoked was that possibility. And I am satisfied to say that in many ways the book does deliver, and that's part of why I liked it so much. And it also makes moving into the recommendation, would I recommend this book? Absolutely. It's not going to be for everyone, because basically what you get, again, similar to Murakami, is a lot of descriptions of everyday life in details which will drive certain people absolutely batshit crazy, coupled with these philosophical ponderings going on via the characters, oftentimes kind of just flat out stopping the story to have a philosophical discussion, And the book even ends on the final chapter on a straight up essay written by one of the characters, so it is diegetically included in the book, on death and the nature of death. So very much that sort of juxtaposition of everyday life coupled with philosophical ponderings. If that sounds enticing to you, absolutely check out this book. I think it's great. And I will now move on into the good points and bad points because I feel like I'm already there. Which, first of all, good point. I love the writing style. Which, again, I can't really attribute so much to Knausgaard yet versus the translator. How much of it is not Knausgaard versus how much of it is... sorry, let me double check his name. Martin Aitken. I don't know. But, again, it captures the sort of simplicity of language, and there's this common misconception that complexity equals depth, and I disagree with that. And a lot of this isn't to say that if something is that they're inversely related, but a lot of times I see people praising authors for their prose and how beautiful the prose is. And yes, the prose is beautiful, and yeah, the story may be good, but it doesn't necessarily lend itself to the kind of depth that I'm looking for in the story. And by keeping things fairly simple in his prose, I think that Knausgaard really, firstly, draws a connection to your relatability with the characters because they do speak and experience their lives in this sort of simple prose, which makes it more relatable to the everyman that we are. But on top of that, I think it further allows the reader to focus on the content rather than so much on the sentence composition or the language, which to some people that's going to be a negative. To me, it's a huge positive and a huge part of why I like this book. And sort of adding on to that, getting into the second point, is that it really does have that suggestive depth. I talked about the philosophical ponderings of the characters, and I really think that the simple prose coupled with the frequent descriptions of everyday life helps balance some of these deeper thoughts by grounding them in really relatable situations so that it doesn't become overwhelming. And I think that's something that you really run a risk of when you're talking about a lot of these philosophical ideas, is having, because if you could just read, if all you want is the philosophy, then just go read the philosophy firsthand. But I think the benefit of a book like this, and novels in general, is the way that they can introduce the philosophy, or at the very least the philosophical ideas, inside the structure of narrative and distill them in a way that you can still appreciate those ideas without necessarily having to go back and read through the complicated language of like Kierkegaard or Hegel or any of these big names. Which isn't to say that fiction is necessarily a substitute for those philosophies, just that it can be a good gateway in introducing those concepts while also drawing on the benefit of fiction and narrative, which is something else that the book does well by having compelling characters. I think none of the characters I really dislike, and that's a bit of an accomplishment considering the range of characters on display. Although, to be fair, most of them are middle class, upper middle class type people, so even the ones that are kind of lower class, they're not exactly, at least as an American, what I would think of as people growing up in the ghetto. I mean, it's set in Norway, so very different economic situation, but they're definitely the type of people with the, I hate using this terminology, but the time and the privilege to have a lot of these sort of deeper philosophical musings. Which isn't to say that every single character is a philosopher. In fact, most characters don't stop and ruminate directly on philosophy in terms of the names of these philosophers, but more they themselves end up embodying something. So if you're worried about the philosophy overriding the story, I would say that you don't need to worry about that. It's pretty well balanced, albeit there is certainly a heavy dose of philosophy there. So if all you want is a story, this ain't it, Chief. In terms of negatives, it is very much the first part of a larger series, and it's almost a positive in the way that you could read just this one book, and I feel I would be satisfied, because to me, the larger questions aren't really important. Like, you never quite get a description or a full understanding of what the titular Morning Star is throughout the story. You never get much of an idea of what, like, where these characters are going. Some characters, I'm able to see what the hindsight of reading the later books, how it ties into the later books, but you'll have certain one-off chapters that are just like, what is even the point of including this? And it's actually one of those one-off chapters that really stood out to me in my memory, but that's neither here nor there. So, in that sense, it could be considered a positive as well as a negative. But it definitely, if you want a full and complete story, doesn't stand on its own. But I do think that if you're okay with sort of things that are vague, things that aren't necessarily complete, kind of like a Twin Peaks type thing in terms of how long that show didn't have closure, then you will still feel satisfied. There is a beginning, middle, end. But if you are somebody who wants everything answered, this ain't it. This ain't going to do it for you. And that's kind of a shame to me, because the problem, and this is really the big negative that comes with the whole series, is it's very difficult to talk about something without having experienced it in its entirety. And even beyond the English translation, of which there are currently 3 translated books into English, and a 4th is planning to is going to be coming out in English next year. And beyond that, there are presently 5 books in Norwegian. I think the latest one came out this year, so probably a 6th will come out next year. I don't quite know how many there are planned to be, but the fact is, as anybody who has read Game of Thrones will tell you, that with every book, there's a chance for the quality of the series to fall off a cliff. We've all been there with series that start out great, only to later on fail to deliver in some way, grow into bloat in some way, and there is just absolutely no guarantee that couldn't happen here. And that is a huge negative hanging over it. And if you are somebody who doesn't want to get started on it until it's finished, then I definitely understand. Though again, I do think if you approach it from more of a thematic appreciation than a necessarily plot and character appreciation, there's definitely enough in The Morning Star and its follow-up for it to stand on its own. The 3rd book definitely has more ties to the first book, which made it a bit more of a stepping stone type novel than something that could really stand solo, but we'll see how the series develops. So those are the positives and negatives. I know I haven't talked about the plot too much, but that's not really my thing, because the fact is it covers about 12 to 15 characters, and they're all living their own lives, and it's about how a big star, well, sorry, I say a big star. It is a big star, but a big star rises and something changes. And I can't really say what changes without getting into the next book and without spoiling things. But, it's kind of background, actually, in the first book. It's not until the next book that it really spells out what's going on. But the fact of the matter is, especially in this first book, because it's kind of in the background, nobody quite knows what to make of it, and consequently the Morning Star itself is not actually really a big thing. It's just kind of a thing that happens and is an omnipresent thing, but it's not really like an inciting incident for anybody. And that's more or less what could make the book difficult in terms of appreciating it in its entirety is the fact that, or not in terms of appreciating it as a standalone versus as part of a larger series, is that you have about 15 different stories which get varying degrees of attention and resolution. Like I said, you have some characters who only show up once. You have characters like Arne, if I pronounce that right, who show up multiple times. You get multiple points of view. You have some storylines that feel like they kind of wrap up in a semi-satisfactory end. Like, it's not great, but you could appreciate it, again, thematically. And then you have some stories that are just left so wide open that again, why even bring it up? Unless, it's all part of this larger story. So, in that sense, I've totally lost my train of thought. In that sense, it's definitely hit and miss in terms of whether to dive into it now or wait until the whole thing. But I definitely think that, description, right. It's definitely difficult to summarize, because you have so many different plot lines of varying length that to sit here and try and tell you what happened to each one would just end up not really spoiling anything, but kind of take away the joy of the book, because part of it is just having really no idea what's going to come next, who you're going to go to next, whose head you're going to be in next, what's going on next. And, it kind of is all over the place, which, again, could be conceived as a negative. Personally, I do like a more focused story with kind of one protagonist that you follow their viewpoint through, because I prefer having one longer story over what basically amounts to 15 closely interconnected short stories. But again, that's personal preference, and if that doesn't sound like it's going to bother you, then absolutely pick it up. And to be dead ass honest, even if it is going to bother you like it would bother me, I still think it's highly worth picking up, because what is there is so good and so worth it. So those are kind of the good and the bad, and from here on out I will talk about theme, and this is where I will probably get into kind of spoilers. So this is the part of the review that's actually for people who have read the book, or for people who don't actually mind spoilers, because it might give them something to look for in reading. So here we go. The big theme of the book is death. There is pretty much no other way around it. I mean, there are other themes, obviously. It's a very big book. It's a very big series. There's going to be a lot of themes. But death is certainly the omnipresent theme that's tying everything together, to the point where, as I said, the final chapter, which is just a 50-page essay titled On Death and the Dead, which, again, written by one of the characters, but absolutely that is the theme of the story. And as my... you know what, I'll hold off on saying that, because this is about the Morning Star. I don't want to get into the future stuff, but you even have one character who dies and temporarily experiences a land of the dead. And a land of the dead is a good place to talk about the fact that it kind of explores death from a few different viewpoints, predominantly Christian, but in the character who dies, he drinks from a river, and the river is, again, pardon the pronunciation, it's the Greek river Lethe, I believe, which is the river of forgetfulness. So he drinks of it and he loses his memories in the sort of in-between world between life and death. So that is from Greek mythology, from a Greek underworld. He describes Knausgaard these men with ox-shaped heads and long ponytails, and I don't know what that's from. I don't know if it's from anything. I don't know if it's an original invention. And of course, you've got the Morning Star itself, which, as one character observes, was used in the Bible to describe both Jesus Christ and Lucifer. So you have the Christian aspect of it, and you have several reflections on death and the intermingling of sort of various mythologies on death. And what this really allows for is a look at death and its role in the world sort of encompassing but separate of a specific religion. And it's particularly interesting because usually one of the challenges with writing literature set in the present day is that it becomes very difficult culture-wise to divorce a story and theme from the place in which it's set. And even here, like I said, it is predominantly Christian, and I assume Norway, at some point, just being European, has very much that background of heavy Christianity and Christian themes. But by having these characters who study, one of them is a literary professor of literature, who's planning a course on death. Another is just a person who is the son of somebody with a lot of money and consequently has had a lot of free time to think and read, and therefore has read a lot of philosophy on death. It frees it up to actually explore death, not explicitly through the lens of just Christianity, albeit definitely with a primarily Christian bent, which from I understand seems pretty common of Knausgaard's work. But that isn't to say that it is pro-Christianity or it is against Christianity, because that's something that one of the characters, Egil, another reason not to talk about characters that I don't have to describe their names, struggles with very much is the existence of God. And it's the way in which Knausgaard is able to take these conflicts and portray these very large philosophical ideas of death and existence and purpose through the point of view of everyday people that lends it, I've said this before, but it lends it a relatability. I talked earlier on about that simple prose and how that simple prose allows you to, first of all, relate to the text more easily, relate to the characters more easily, but also to not focus so much on the language and the what, on the how is being said, but to focus more on the what is being said. And it's the same here by having this morning star, which is this great change in the world. It's something nobody's ever seen before, and it's awe-inspiring, but at the same time, it's portrayed as very boring, almost in a way, insofar as it happens, everybody is very shocked by it, but after a few minutes, people just kind of adapt because nothing really happens that they can see. And they just go back to their lives. And yeah, there's talk about it on TV shows. What is it? On the radio. But ultimately, it's not like a fantasy or science fiction inciting incident thing where the whole world has suddenly changed overnight. But again, it's that mundanity of it that allows it to be so grounded and so approachable in my eyes, because it allows these more complicated ideas to then take center stage. It frees you up to appreciate the conversations going on. And I think of all the characters, Egil, as I said, sorry, I'm butchering his name, is definitely the most interesting for me because he's definitely the most definitely the most conflicted character in terms of his existential crisis. You have characters like Arne, whose conflict is more in his relationship with his wife, who is suffering a mental breakdown. You have Katrina, I don't know. The problem with reading in my head is that when I have to say these names out loud, I have no idea. But anyway, Katrina, Catherine, who is... Catherine, that's what it is, sorry. Who is more kind of trapped in what she feels is a marriage where she doesn't love her husband, but her husband hasn't done anything explicitly wrong. And so she doesn't really know, she doesn't want to stay in the relationship because there's no passion there, but having 2 kids and having no real reason or justification for a divorce, she doesn't quite know what to do or where to go. And those are, again, the variety of approaches and everything is what makes it, I think, broadly relatable. So for me, Egil being the most existentially conflicted is what makes him particularly such a compelling character, and why I'm primarily going to be focusing on him when talking about some of the themes in the book, because he will pretty much just kind of state outright some of those themes, including the final essay, which is actually by him. And one of the great themes that is sort of a through line between Catherine and Eagle is belief and faith, where for Eagle, he talks early on about freedom and his struggle, his desire for a sense of freedom and identity, and how pretty much everything in his childhood was about breaking away and trying to become his own person and rebelling against everything, to the point where he even is attracted to the idea of abandoning a name, just living day by day, no savings, no income, just, working at farms, traveling around the nomadic, vagabond lifestyle to be truly free. But he then suffers a mental breakdown, and what ends up bringing him back to society is establishing rules, establishing boundaries, to the point where he almost turns away, and he doesn't become openly hostile to the idea of freedom, but he starts to see the desire or the urge for freedom as very juvenile, and kind of likes to establish boundaries, which arguably could be one of the reasons that he eventually turns to God and religion, because it existentially provides a kind of framework around which to believe and to structure your life. But what I found so compelling about his version of freedom is that it is a very good portrayal of freedom from a young mind, in the sense that I think everybody, to a certain extent, wants to be free. We all want to have our own thoughts, to know our thoughts are our own. We want our identity to be ours, and consequently we want our beliefs and our expressions to be ours, and not a product of something else or something we're told to believe. But what I think really strikes me about his growth ties back into Solenoid by names, Mircea Karatesu. I am so sorry, I'm so bad at names. Anyway, is the idea that freedom is ultimately an illusion. No matter what cage you currently find yourself trapped in, breaking free of a cage will only ever find you in a bigger cage. So for, like in Solenoid, he talks about potentially escaping from the third dimension into a fourth dimension, and that book is very much set within the confines of an Eastern European country post Soviet collapse, so definitely not a rich place, definitely not the kind of place that you would want to live. So the idea of escape is very compelling. It's in contrast to Eagle, who has everything handed to him, and his life would be very enviable to the protagonist of Solenoid. The protagonist of Solenoid has every reason to want to escape, and so he spends lots of time thinking in his head about tesseracts in the fourth dimension, and how if you could only just perceive the fourth dimension, then you could kind of slip sideways out of your existence into something else and be free. But what he also acknowledges in Solenoid is that freedom, again, that recognition that a fourth dimension still has limits, still has bounds, because beyond it must exist a fifth dimension and a sixth dimension, which is also something that was covered in Flatland, of which Solenoid draws very heavily from. And I think that what the Morning Star, and particularly the character of Eagle, finds through his adventures, relationship with freedom, is that ultimately freedom is a mirage. everything you shed in the name of becoming free only reveals something more that traps you. You know, you can shed the trappings of human society, but you will always be trapped by human skin, human mind, human thoughts. Something is always binding you. And thus, freedom becomes about something else. It becomes about finding a way to exist within these boundaries that becomes the more significant thing. And to this, we come to his final essay on death, because in a way, death is the one thing that binds us all. For some people, death is the thing that gives their life meaning by the fact that it sets it on a time limit. For some people, death is what strikes fear into their hearts. There's a fun line in here about how in the old days, here we go. This explains, for example, how in the Middle Ages miracles were observed in abundance, whereas today none are observed at all. Basically saying we see what we want to see. So it's about modes of thought, modes of thinking about death, and how those modes of thinking end up defining our relationship to death, and whether or not death is the sort of not end of life, but the sort of end of freedom of choice of your individual being, as sort of rational thought would dictate, because rational thought dictates that we are beings of matter and flesh and have no concept of spirit, and thus death is simply the end of that. Or whether death is something else, whether, is death the end of life, or is death merely another stage in existence, or perhaps is death, in my personal viewpoint, is death simply a reversion to the natural state of non-being. And what I really appreciated about The Morning Star is whether you appreciate the characters or not, or rather, whether you agree with the characters or not, the book itself never makes any strong sort of thesis statements in terms of this is absolutely the way to think. The book is not telling you what to think. It is merely offering a jumping off point of several different possibilities. And I can safely say that, especially in the second book, the one part in particular in the second book, but a lot of what is discussed in The Morning Star will absolutely stay with me. They are things that I think of on a regular basis. I thought about them before The Morning Star. Having read The Morning Star, I feel very much like I have a better understanding of those thoughts, and it helped me articulate some things that I wouldn't have otherwise been able to articulate. And I think it has given me a broader appreciation of things. And especially, like I said, in the second book, like they are things that will stick with me forever. And that's why I, even on a second read through, find it such a fascinating book, because it is so big and it is so dense that I am the type of person that will need multiple read throughs to fully appreciate everything. And it's the kind of book that'll be fun to come back to over the years, not every year, but every other year, every year, who knows how many times. Point is, as the older I get, it'll be a fun book to return to find how have my thoughts changed. Do I relate to different characters or whatnot? So just an awesome book all around. Lots to think about, lots to explore, but all conveyed in a compelling way through dialogue and prose that is engaging, but really lets you think about the topics that it's trying to bring up. So I have talked about this book for 35 minutes, all while saying I feel like almost nothing of worth. So that will probably be the nature of this channel going forward. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time.